Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and welcome to episode 5 of the Critical Corner. Now, if you're new to this channel, first of all, welcome. And second of all, the Critical Corner is a series that I do on this channel where I do reviews in shorter form of either all movies or all music. Today's episode is focused on all movies. Let's go ahead and get into our first movie.
Up to it.
I'm feeling fine. It was my idea, and it took a couple days. I can do a couple days.
Okay, guys, I'm off. Have fun.
Okay, our first film on the docket today is The Lodge. This was a horror movie that came out back in January. It technically had a 2019 release, but it was very limited release in 2019, so I'm more counting it for 2020 since it was released to the public theaters in 2020. The Lodge is about a broken family who loses their mother to suicide, and the dad eventually starts dating this other girl who was originally part of this cult. Her name is Grace, and she comes into the family much to the kids' dismay, who do not really want a new mother figure in their life. Eventually, the whole family decides to go to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and the kids are basically meant to bond with Grace while they're on this cabin retreat. The Lodge is a really interesting horror movie. It's one I have some pretty complicated thoughts on, because there's some really good aspects of this movie and there's some really weak ones. I do almost wish that this movie had stayed with the sort of premise it was going for its first half. Its first half is very Twilight Zone-esque, and I like when the movie is about, like, the kids and Grace trying to figure out the mysteries of the cabin and what's going on there. But there is this sort of second half twist that honestly was a little bit too obvious in some ways, and the twist is ultimately pretty underwhelming. It's not really the most compelling twist you could come up with, and it's something that you've seen before. If you've seen the movie, you'll know what I mean with this twist. It's not necessarily a bad twist per se, but it definitely brings the movie down. But the stuff after that twist is honestly some of the most chilling horror I've seen in 2020. There are some really good scares in the second half of this movie, especially in the last 30 minutes. And Grace is revealed to be a really menacing entity once the kids strip away any of the niceties of her and reveal the monster that was hiding beneath all this time. And the ending of this movie in particular actually sent cold chills up my spine with what it was doing. The ending shot in particular is incredible and really leaves this movie out on a memorable note. So, despite my problems with this movie, which they are there, I still did enjoy this movie, even if it isn't among the best horror films I've ever seen. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars.
A character. Your boss, Mickey Pearson.
You're too smart to be blackmailing us, Fletcher.
Next up is The Gentleman, directed by Guy Ritchie, who made Aladdin last year, which was not a good movie at all. Thankfully, this movie is better than that. I overall found this film to be sort of average. It's a decent gangster film, but it's not really that different from anything I've seen before. There are some good elements of this. For example, I think the dialogue is really good. The writing is pretty sharp in this movie, and there's a lot of really witty moments. A lot of these really good witty moments come from Hugh Grant and Charlie Hunnam. Their two characters were easily the best in the movie, the most well-developed and the most compelling to watch. I liked that the movie was framed around their characters because they're both definitely the oddest of the bunch, and they both have the most interesting stuff going on with them. And plus, the commentary on movie making and on screenwriting from these characters is actually pretty interesting. It doesn't come across as pretentious as I was worried it was going to at the beginning of the film. Matthew McConaughey is also pretty solid in this film, although I feel like he was sort of underwhelming as the main character. He just wasn't super interesting, and it's pretty much like any other gangster type I've seen, like where he's just this super respectful and super poised guy, but can become unhinged at a moment's notice. I just feel like there's a lot of gangster types that are just like that, so McConaughey's character ultimately didn't really pique my interest all that much at the end of the day. Probably the biggest problem with this movie is how it sets up its plot and how its story can occasionally become really confusing. This is especially true in the beginning, where they're trying to set everything up and there's so much information being thrown at you in an exposition dump sort of way that it can really be hard to wrap your brain around. Thankfully, this movie is saved by some pretty interesting characters and by some sharp and witty dialogue, and overall a pretty good sense of fun that happens in the end of the movie. So I'll give this a solid 3 out of 5 stars.
Adolf Hitler, now Capone. Hitler's dead. Capone lives like a king in Florida.
He has full-blown dementia.
Now, on the other side of the coin, this movie, Capone, is not worth your time at all. I don't know who gave Josh Trank another chance at the camera, at directing, but after this film, I hope that people have learned their lesson, because this movie is terrible. Easily one of the worst films of the year. Now, this film could have been interesting, especially having Tom Hardy starring as Al Capone in old age and suffering from dementia. I think this film had an interesting concept with seeing the last days of Capone's life and how dementia was affecting him and how it affected his family. Instead, this movie wants to give off a lot of these sort of cool visual moments that the movie thinks they're cool, I think, but ultimately, most of them are really cheesy and over the top and obvious to the point of being criminal. Doesn't want us to feel bad for Capone because the movie clearly shows us that Capone is not a good person. Doesn't want us to feel bad for the family because it also shows us that the family members aren't that great of people either. The film just isn't clear on what it wants, and because of that, the vision of this movie is an absolute train wreck. And plus, Tom Hardy is quite bad in this movie as the main character. It pains me to say that, because I love Tom Hardy as an actor. He just plays this character way too over the top. Capone mainly speaks in grunts and barely distinguishable sentences, which I sort of get as a point since he's suffering from dementia, but the voice that Tom Hardy chooses to use for Capone is so incredibly annoying. The movie doesn't seem concerned with us having any type of connection to him, or even remotely wanting us to understand him. And because of that, it's hard to care for Capone one way or the other. This character feels like a caricature and not a real thing at all. Kyle MacLachlan is easily the biggest highlight here as the Doctor. I think he brings a lot to this character, even when the character is pretty generically written. So overall, Capone was just a mess, one of the worst movies of the year, and I definitely don't recommend it. 1.5 out of 5 stars for me.
I guess I just never thought I'd need anyone else.
Hey, hold up.
$10 for 3 pages.
Next up is the most recent film on this list, the Netflix original The Half of It, the second directorial film from Alice Wu. This film is about a young girl named Ellie who is in love with this older girl named Aster, and she's too nervous to tell her because of the values that her town has that would make her coming out be a very bad thing, and also she's generally a very introverted person. Then she meets this jock named Paul who is also in love with Aster, and eventually she decides to help him be in love with her and help him date her. And the two sort of form a friendship through the process of this, while also both of them vying for Aster at the same time, creating a pretty complicated situation by the end of the film. I did really enjoy this movie, even though it had some flaws to it. First of all, this movie is going to be like pretty much any coming-of-age film you've seen. It's going to have all the tropes that you expect. It's also going to have some typical rom-com tropes, but this movie does have a leg above some of its coming-of-age counterparts on Netflix. I think specifically because this movie has a more realistic approach to telling its love story. It isn't overly sentimental about the relationships here, and it actually ends them out on a note that you would not expect. Also, acting-wise, this movie is really solid. I think both of the main actors are really good, and they have a great chemistry together, and the girl who plays Aster is definitely the strongest link here. I think she has the most compelling arc of any character in the movie, and I appreciated what the film did with her and where it ended off her story. So The Half of It is a really interesting movie that I think is more than worth your time and is definitely one of the better Netflix originals. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for me.
This is an extraction.
So who are the players?
Biggest drug lord in India versus biggest drug lord in Bangladesh.
Some mythic shit, huh?
Alright, next up is Extraction, another Netflix movie starring Chris Hemsworth. In this movie, mercenary Tyler Rake is charged to go rescue this child of a famous crime lord and basically bring him to safety in America. But when he comes there, there's all sorts of danger surrounding this kid as another crime lord of another sector in India is coming after him. And it's basically up to Tyler to get him out of there before it's too late. Now, this movie could have been a very cliched action movie, and in some places it unfortunately is a very cliched action movie. However, there is a little bit more to this movie than I think might meet the eye, especially in terms of how the action is shot. This movie is directed by a stunt coordinator, and because of that, the action in this movie is really good. There is some solid action scenes, especially this one-take scene that is really quite breathtaking. Also, there are some pretty good characters in this movie, especially Saju, who is the child's original bodyguard, who is also trying to take him to safety, although he has different reasons for doing it than Tyler does. But ultimately, I think he was a more compelling character, and I almost wish the movie had made him the main character rather than Tyler. He was a much more morally gray and morally complex character, and I wish we had followed him a little bit more and been able to sympathize with him even more, because I already felt sympathy for him in this film, but I think he should have been the main character, honestly. The child character in this movie is also pretty interesting, although I don't think he was developed as well as he could have been. There are some good beginning moments of this movie which actually show how lonely he is, and there's some frightening commentary on how used he is to violence and to killing. I think the movie could have emphasized on this tragedy maybe even more, and made him even more sympathetic to the audience. Now, Tyler Rake is a character I have some complications with, because Chris Hemsworth is great as his character. I think he does some really good acting as him, but the character himself is such a generic action hero cliche. He's not a bad character to follow necessarily, but he just makes the movie feel even more generic than it already does, honestly. Still, overall, Extraction is a decent movie with some really good action, some good characters, and it's overall a decent watch. 3 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, we have the movie Possessor, which is about a woman who works for this underground government agency where she puts on this machine and she possesses the body of another human, and this human is basically meant to take down a criminal or a high-paying hit job. And the person who this woman possesses is charged with the crime while the woman gets to go scot-free. Eventually, this woman possesses a man who eventually sort of seems to realize that someone has taken him over, and it becomes a psychological battle for the two as to which one is in control versus which one isn't. This is a harrowing psychological thriller. Definitely my favorite movie of the year so far. There are so many cool things to this movie, and honestly, I don't want to say too much about it because this is more a movie that is meant to be experienced by you for the first time. There are so many shocking things in this movie that are just incredible to see. The visual horror in this movie is some of the best I've seen all year. The movie really goes there in some moments with its horror, and it's truly one of the most spine-tingling experiences I've had with horror in recent memory. Andrea Riseborough is excellent as the main character. You never really know what this character is going to do. She's really unpredictable, and any action that she does is surprising, because she'll do one thing one moment, but then the next moment, she'll decide to do something completely different. This character is really hard to get a complete understanding of, and I sort of appreciate that. Christopher Abbott is also great in this movie, and plays a more sympathetic character who is getting possessed. And I really like what he does with his character, and his character eventually has some layers revealed to him that are super interesting as well. Visually, this movie is absolutely stunning. There are some really creative moments in here that I have not seen in any other movie before, and that really makes this movie have its own distinct identity. especially in the way it visually shows how a person is possessed. It is one of the most bizarre, out there things I've ever seen, and it really gives this movie its uncanny valley feel that it most definitely deserves. So for all those reasons, I'm giving this movie a very strong 4 out of 5 stars. Definitely recommended, especially for those of you looking for a very unique movie experience. You'll get that here in spades. So yeah, that was episode 5 of the Critical Corner. What were your all's thoughts on any of the films I talked about? Let me know in the comments below. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies. If any of that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments down below what you would like me to do next. Leave a like on this video and subscribe if you are interested in seeing more videos from me. Thank you all so much for watching, and until then, I will see you all in the next video.